Hello. This week we're going to be talking about observational research. We've done a little bit of this when we talked about children and coded a videotape of children before, but this is kind of a broader scale picture. You're also going to recognize some of this as we'll talk about coding, which was part of what we did for the content analysis. So some of this is going to be drawing on things that we've done before, but also coming from a different angle. All right, so let's get it going. Okay, so there's multiple approaches to observational research. We look at things both qualitatively and quantitatively. If you guys may be familiar with the You Can Be ABCs, if not, Google it, it's adorable. Kiddo raps through the ABCs and all the different kinds of jobs you could have that start with each of the letters of the alphabet. He's adorable. But if we were looking at this in terms of an observation of a kid doing this behavior, we could look at um, uh, lots of different things. We could look at it quantitatively. We could look at it qualitatively. Quantitatively, we would be looking at discrete. In other words, you can identify where it starts and stops, right? Discrete counting either things that happened, behaviors, objects, things that he says, right? So you could do how many times the kid claps per letter. You could talk about how many times, how many words the kid says in a minute, right? Both of those would be quantitative ways of looking at this behavior from an observational perspective. You could also look at this qualitatively. Qualitatively, we often ask people to give accounts of what they do or to explain what's going on. Here at the very beginning of the You Can Be ABCs, Dad gives a account of what's going on. He explains what's about to happen. So that could be part of how you quantitatively analyze this. Usually, again, this kind of lines up with the types of variables that you're using, discrete being a interval or an integral, accountable one bit of information, one data point, qualitative being more about coding and thinking about categories that things belong in. So we also talk about observation in terms of a couple different other ways, systematic and naturalistic. Naturalistic observation is also known as field work or field observation, and this is observation of participants in their natural environment. This approach borrows a lot historically from anthropology and animal observation. We usually have the goal of um, either observing and not influencing the people that we are observing, or being very careful about quantifying or being able to reflect on how we are influencing the people that we are observing, right? So if I go into a second grader classroom to observe them and I'm wearing a big huge like clown costume and everything, they're going to, at least for the first little bit of the interaction, be reacting to me and that I'm a stranger in there with a clown costume, as opposed to doing whatever they usually do in a second grade classroom. So in naturalistic observation, there's either the attempt to not interfere or the attempt to be very reflective and very measured about how much have I changed what else is going on here by being here or by observing. The goal here for naturalistic observation is to describe and interpret. We don't interpret cause here. We can't say what caused what. We can just say this happened. We can interpret it a little bit, but mostly we're describing. And these rich descriptions that come out of naturalistic observation provide us with a good basis for future studies. One example of naturalistic observation, and the reason this picture is up here on the slide, is that we have often used one-way mirrors or one-way glass so that observers can watch children in playrooms and classrooms and not be and the kids not know whether there's somebody there watching them. right? So it looks like a mirror or a black kind of panel, as in this case, from one side, and from the other side, it's see-through, so they can see what the kids are doing. All right. So one of the issues with naturalistic observation, as I said before, is figuring out how much to interact with whatever the phenomenon is. Whether you are not going to touch anything, not going to let anybody see that you are observing, and try to influence things as little as possible, or whether you are going to interact and engage with the people that you are observing and try to be really reflective of how that is maybe changing or influencing what else is going on. And one of the ways of doing this, again taken from cultural anthropology, is the idea of participant observation. A participant observer is someone who's participating with the community of interest while they are observing them. Um, and the picture over here on the slide, the woman in the middle is Margaret Mead, one of the groundbreaking cultural anthropologists, one of the first female cultural anthropologists. Did some really interesting work with folks in Polynesia, and one of my heroes. But she wrote a lot about and thought a lot about participant observation and how her being a part of these communities that she was in affected the ways that they did their daily lives, handled things, and therefore what she was able to observe about how things went in those communities. Um, the issue again with participant observation, as I alluded to on the last slide, is objectivity, right? So, and that's what we talk, or objectivity in terms of whether people are, whether you are able to understand what's going on, right? The thing here, and as we would talk about it in anthropology, would be the insider versus outsider perspective, emic versus edic perspectives. And this has to do with whether you are an insider and so you know the ways of that community, but you're not able to separate yourself from them enough to see what's going on. It's just, well, of course, we have black-eyed peas and cabbage on New Year's. Like, of course we do that. That is just part of how the world works. And I can't imagine a world where people don't do that. This is a tradition in my family and not necessarily in other families, right? On the other hand, you could be an outsider and see, wow, look at all these people who are eating different things, or throwing rice at weddings, or are kissing at midnights and staying up late on this one night of the year. What is this about? Right? So being a complete outsider, you miss important information. Being a complete insider, you also miss important information. So the idea with participant observation is that you get a little bit of both, right? So it helps you to be objective a little bit because you understand things from the perspective of the people who you're observing because you're participating with them. On the other hand, you kind of could get too personally involved and therefore not be able to be more objective about what's going on. It also, as I talked about before, has to do with or relates to the idea of reactivity, the idea that being watched may affect what you're doing, right? So the fact that Margaret Mead was with these women in the picture might have affected how they handled the way they dressed, or the fact that they had the necklaces tied around their neck in a certain way. The fact that she was there might have influenced what went on. Okay, so some limitations for naturalistic observation. So naturalistic observation can take a huge investment of time and energy, especially if you are a participant observer. You can also do naturalistic observation as a complete outsider, where you're just watching kids or people, and that can work, but it's not a very complete understanding of the situation. People have sometimes mixed this naturalistic observation of folks outside in public spaces with later following those same folks up with and interviewing them or surveying them. Again, naturalistic observation, we can't determine cause. Um, and the other piece is that sometimes when you observe things out in the world, even if you're taking really careful notes and observing all of the factors as closely as possible, you may not be able to determine how comparable that what you'd observed is to other scenarios. For example, the woman in this picture is looking at streets and taking a picture of some graffiti after a protest. Um, but it is not it's hard to tell whether a similar type of protest is going to ever happen in that space again, right? That it's hard to say, oh, well, this is how protests happen, or this is how protests happen in this place. We don't know. We don't know what about what she's observing is generalizable. We can describe what she saw, describe what happened, but that doesn't necessarily tell us much about other cities or other protests or other events in this particular situation. Okay, so systematic observation, and this is the stuff that I've done more of in my research, and this is careful observation of behaviors in a controlled context. So what we do would be to control the context and systematic coding of a behavior that we're interested in. And this is often paired with video or audio taping so that you can look closely back at what has been observed. So in both of these pictures here at the bottom, we see situations that people I have worked with have studied where they set up a learning situation where parents and children, where families were working together to figure out a puzzle or to learn how to use a new toy, right? And so they were observing how the families and how the kids interacted with the adults and with each other and trying to figure out this new toy. Um, so they're creating a situation, right? The context is controlled. They're also going to be coding for specific behaviors in these contexts, and you want to set up the situation so that you can see those specific behaviors, right? So you want to choose the situation that you're going to observe to maximize the likelihood of observing whatever it is that you're interested in observing, but you also want it to be as naturalistic as possible. So researchers in both of these cases figured, well, these folks are in their homes. They are dealing with a new fun toy. This is pretty low stakes. It's not super stressful for anyone. But the likelihood that they deal with something new or a new toy or a new object or a puzzle to figure out as a family in their new house, that's not too unusual, right? We're controlling it a little bit. We're making sure that they're playing with something or working with something that they haven't worked with before, and that all of the video or families we're looking at are working with the same thing. But it's not too unusual for a family to be trying to figure out a new toy together for a kid. So that's kind of the crux of systematic observation. All right, and this is the end of our first video. We'll come back with a second video in a second to talk a little bit more about systematic observation, some other aspects of observational studies.